In this video, we're going to be talking about dominant cultures, co-cultures, and cultural identity. So, a dominant culture school is a learned system of norms held by the majority of empowered people in a society. So, in translation, that is kind of like the status quo, right? What we define as that. So, the people are kind of like at the top of the social pyramid. Um, this definition, as it mentions, is learned, and so I think it's important to remember that norms are communicated from generation to generation, which means that it can also be modified. Um, Social norms morph over time. If we think about, from the 1960s to today, America does look very different. It's very slow. It's a very slow progression, and there's a lot of people that really have to fight in order to change that status quo or that dominant culture in America. But it is shifting, and so let me give you an example of, like, in the 1960s, it was very much America was very much, and for a long time after, has been very much been rooted on, or it's the dominant culture has been defined by white, heterosexual, Protestant, wealthy white men. So I don't mean that bad. I'm not trying to bash anybody right now. I'm just saying that is what defined the dominant culture. So you might see, like, if you ever watch movies or shows from the 1960s, something that I always noticed was that everyone on like a plane, so say people were traveling, the character or the people were always dressed really nice, like in suits and hats, and everybody had these nice matching jackets, and the women were all dressed very formally. And I asked my dad about this, and I was like, Dad, why do they do this? And my dad said, well, at the time, that was what was expected. People didn't fly very often, and the people who flew were usually very wealthy. And it was usually for something like a big event, and so everyone treated it that way. But it was mainly people who, like I said, could afford that had that lifestyle, but that did not include very many people. So in this example, what I'm illustrating is this at that point in time, it was mainly white men who were well off enough to be traveling, and they were usually traveling for a very specific purpose. So they defined the culture of flying on a plane. Like, what are you supposed to wear? So when other people, like even women or people who are outside that dominant culture, or the people who were the group that was defining the dominant culture, came and got on a plane, they also felt that they needed to fit in and wear formal attire or more formal attire. So that's like an example of someone, like that dominant culture influencing the people in a particular situation. But if you look now over time, we see a shift in that, because flying on a plane has become way more reasonable. I mean, even though it's still expensive, it's become way more reasonable than back in the 1960s, and something that people do more often and that people from all backgrounds do. So therefore, that's why you get on a plane and you're going to see a wide range of outfits and attire and social norms. Okay, so that is dominant culture. This also leads us to something known as bicultural. So bicultural refers to those that appreciate and embrace various aspects of two originally distinct cultures. To translate that basically means new cultures that are created through processes like immigration. So we may see these more often, like around borders, or just cities that large groups of people of the same culture decide to migrate to. So this might be kind of like Mexican American culture. I had a student who told me a lot about this and about differences, like his family. He moved here, I think he was the second or third generation Mexican American. And so he was telling me a lot about how biculturalism has really impacted him. But that's kind of looking at it big picture, right? Biculturalism is in like two big distinct cultures that have kind of come together to fuse a kind of a new one. But there's also aspects of biculturalism for each of us through or all of us, I guess, regardless if it's two big dominant cultures that have kind of fused together, two distinct cultures, I guess I should say, and then have fused together. There's also the aspects of all the co-cultures that we are a part of that also define who we are and how we think, and that may differ from the dominant culture. So, what is co-culture? Co-cultures are groups of people within the larger culture who hold common values, beliefs, attitudes, and customs that differ from those of the dominant culture. So, this includes all of us. The translation that I kind of wrote for this was these are aspects of our identity that have a strong impact on our beliefs and values. This can also be defined kind of as cultural identity. And cultural identity are basically just parts of our self-concept based on how closely we associate with the dominant culture and various co-cultures, meaning like what parts of you or how much of you really connects with the dominant culture and or these multiple co-cultures that you are also a part of, whatever you lean towards. So, I do think it's important to note that co-cultures and cultural identity greatly impact our communication. And so one specific way that the book specifically mentions is code switching. And so code switching is shifting your communication patterns, whether like your linguistics, I mean, it could actually be changing languages. It could also just be the way in which you say words, also your nonverbal patterns. Every culture or ethnic group, you have a particular way of communicating, and that includes the way in which you say things, and it also includes the how, like your body language. So that is actually really impacted by the culture you're in and your cultural identity. So this aspect of you, like you identify, like kind of like with the Mexican American student with these two big cultures. You think about this. You think about like whenever I'm around this, like my American friends who are like, white, that are more like the dominant culture, like what I think the dominant culture is, then I may speak more like them. And then vice versa, if I'm at home with my family who are very much very much rooted in Mexican culture, I'm going to shift maybe speaking Spanish, or I may just shift the way in which I speak to that. And so that's called code switching. Switching, like depending on the group you're around and how much of your cultural identity you kind of want to show, versus if you want to lean towards your more dominant culture side or your more co-culture side. Okay, so let's go on with what influences our cultural identity. Well, we know that cultural identity is really talking about like the aspect of our self-concept, right? That kind of leans more towards the dominant culture or the co-cultures that we identify with. To kind of clarify this for you, to help you better understand that, let's look at just a couple. I'm just going to just list and kind of quickly define the ones I need to define. Some co-cultures you and most all of us identify with, and kind of they do make up part of our self-concept. So the first that I would like to go over is race. And so there's also race and ethnicity. So let me just quickly tell you the difference between that. Race is based on your biological characteristics. Like if you did a DNA test, or like what are those tests where you can spin the whole bottle? What's that called? Ancestry. Like if you do an ancestry test, that is going to tell you all these biological characteristics. All right, well then you have ethnicity. And so this is more so shared cultural heritage that are learned. Like, for example, I'm a good example of this. Biologically, I am Native American, Irish, African, or I guess, or Black, and then lots of like random, like French and lots of random things, to be completely honest. But I have all types of these different races within me. However, I was raised in America in a Caucasian or white home. And so I identify as white, even if I don't look white. Correct? See how I'm saying that? So, like, ethnicity versus race is sometimes different. Okay, so then sex versus gender, kind of the same thing. Sex is biological traits, whereas gender is learned roles in communication patterns, norms, those kinds of things. That's often defined also by like the culture you're in. Okay, and then there's sexual orientation, there's religion, socioeconomic status. So that's kind of like where you feel like you fall as far as economics, and then age, generation, and disability. Okay, so this is the end of the video, but maybe just take a quick second and just think about, with each of these different cultures that I mentioned, where you feel like you fall. Where do you identify in these different cultures, and maybe think about how this has shaped your communication and your self-concept. You don't have to write it anywhere, just think about it.